Korea and Vietnam with technology that they had installed in the Soviet Union. And yet the way this world is put together, it's the Harrimans and the Hammers and the Morgans and the Rockefellers who are admired and lauded. And those who plead for human decency and state the facts of dictatorship are slandered and insulted. And we find, regrettably, academics fall over themselves to perpetuate the myth.
So back in the early 1930s, Gerard Swope of General Electric and Bernard Baruch and their friends were building the 5-year plans in Russia, but they went inactive elsewhere in the world. And this is one period where I've been able to develop most of the story. Roosevelt's New Deal, the NRA, National Recovery Administration, was not drawn up by the Brain Trust or Roosevelt's advisors. It was drawn up by Gerard Swope of General Electric. And I've published the whole thing in the book I've just produced. I call it Swope's plan. It wasn't FDR's plan at all. And Herbert Hoover was quite correct when he called it fascism, because Roosevelt's New Deal was nothing else but fascism along the lines of the Mussolini corporate state. And our friends, Bernard Baruch and General Electric, building up the Soviet Union, were also very active financing and promoting and writing for Roosevelt in the early 1930s. But also, they were active behind Hitler. It's interesting that both Hitler and Roosevelt came to power in early 1933. Now, the story of the promotion of Hitler by our own corporate socialists is yet unpublished. But I'll tell you this much, it'll give you the flavor of the book. I have the bank transfer slips, which is about the hardest kind of evidence you can get, of funds going from large corporations to the Nazi Party, and particularly a political slush fund operated by Rudolf Hess. This was very important in the early 1930s when the Nazis needed all the money they could get to finance their gangs of goons going around the streets beating up people and the various payoffs and this kind of thing. One of these transfer slips refers to German General Electric, 60,000 Reichsmarks. And two directors of German General Electric will interest you, or should interest you. One is Gerard Swope, General Electric, and the other is Owen Young of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. So what we find is, when we begin to probe behind the scenes of history, is that we have these gentlemen promoting 3 brands of socialism all at the same time. They're building the first 5-year plan in the Soviet Union, they're writing Roosevelt's New Deal for him, and they're trying to get Hitler into power in Germany, all at the same time. So let's go back to the building of the Soviet Union. During World War II, you will remember, there was the massive Lend-Lease program. This pretty much replaced any capacity the Soviet Union might have lost in World War II, but more importantly, it brought the Soviet Union to a fundamentally new technological horizon. I've covered the whole story of this build-up in the Hoover series of books. By 1946, the Soviets had a capacity to do certain things themselves, but they could manufacture the shells of factories, that is the building, which is not too difficult, and they could duplicate simple equipment, simple lathes, this kind of thing. But they still needed, and still need today, foreign technology to advance the technological horizon for a quite simple reason, that a socialist planned society cannot advance technologically by itself. And once again, Western businessmen were only too happy to oblige. And once again, they went into the Soviet Union in the 1950s, certainly the 1960s, and you'll see the peak of this in the last few years under Kissinger. And to give you again some examples from the development in these 20 years, you will find in mining equipment of firms like Joy Manufacturing. Non-ferrous metals, you'll find they're using, for example, the international nickel process for nickel smelting, refining. Iron and steel is an exception. The Soviets adopted the classical blast furnace back in the 1930s. Their plans were largely laid out by the Frame Corporation of Chicago,
It's a very simple process. What they did was build bigger units, what I call scaling up. And in classical blast furnace technology, they have not come back to the West, but they have done, particularly in rolling techniques and what you might call the high technology forms of steel and metals. In petroleum processes, you can see the copying of the Lend-Lease refineries all the way up to today. I think just a few weeks ago, there were recent agreements to transfer more petroleum technology to the Soviet Union. In chemicals, Arm & Hammer, Occidental Petroleum, of course, has always played a key role. Textiles, we find Soviet nylon, all their synthetic fabrics are Western fabrics, but of course with different model numbers, categories. Motor vehicles, all the motor vehicle plants I can identify in the Soviet Union have equipment from the West. They have been able to reproduce simple transfer lines, but as you know, with the Kalmar plant, still today, the Soviets require equipment mainly from the United States. Soviet Atomic Energy, their first reactor was a copy of the Hanford reactor, but more importantly, they couldn't have achieved their atomic energy program without United States help. I'm very skeptical today about the Rosenberg spy story. What is much more important is how did the Soviets get the industrial technology, the equipment, very specialized kind of equipment, which is needed for an atomic energy program. This could only come from one of three countries, United States, Switzerland, or Great Britain. Locomotors, for example, we find General Electric is the standard. In aircraft, we find all the Rolls-Royce engines powered the MiGs over Korea. The door, for example, on some of the aircraft is a Boeing door. You go right down the line, it's there. Merchant Marine, I calculated that exactly because the Soviets have published a very exhaustive catalog, great big fat thing, of their Soviet ships. Every ship is there, cataloged with its technical specification. And I can tell you exactly 67% of the hulls were built in the West. 80% of the engines were built in the West. The 20% that were not built in the West were built in the Soviet Union, mainly at Bryansk and in Leningrad, under technical assistance agreements. There's no such thing as a Soviet marine diesel engine. That's what got the Soviet Weekly upset in London and said I was wild. And of course I pointed to their own catalog, and it's right there if they bother to get a calculating machine, which of course will have to be Western, and they can repeat what I did. The computer technology is courtesy of IBM and Radio Corporation of America. But there's an English corporation, International Computers, which has transferred the most advanced of its own computer technology. I did happen to meet a director of this particular company last April when I was in England, and I pointed this out to him that it was his own suicide. He had more to lose than England, and I pointed this out to him that it was his own suicide. He had more to lose than I had. And his argument was that, well, the Americans do it, why shouldn't the British do it? And he was actually unable to see that it was his own suicide. But I did also meet a gentleman from the Dunlop Rubber Company, and Dunlop has been very important transferring rubber tire technology to the Soviet Union, who admitted that so far as that area is concerned, I was exactly correct. In fact, I hadn't got all of it. But he said, well, even if it is my own suicide, I will continue to do it because it's business. And I had no answer to that one. So what I'm saying is that in brief, all Western technology, all Soviet technology from 1917 right down to the present day comes from the West. And this is based on a very precise technical analysis. It's technical. I look at engines and machines and I look at specifications. It's not something I imagined. I've been at this thing over a decade and a half and no one yet has proven me wrong on a technical factor. And this is approximately the position today, except that under Kissinger, the Soviets have been able to achieve a fundamentally new technological horizon of course, with a financial subsidy, because they're getting loans at 6% when you have to pay 10 and 12% with a financial subsidy from the United States. Now, the big problem that I had in the early 1970s was that this was not the whole story. There were at least two remaining problems. One, we were building up Soviet military capability, and there were indications, and I was a little unsure about this in 1970, that this was a deliberate policy on the part of the United States. I called it the X factor. I spotted it perhaps as early as the late 1960s that there was something operating there to enable these massive transfers to continue over a period of decades. And any time you pointed it out, you were immediately slapped down. There was some kind of behind-the-scenes pressure making for these massive transfers. Now, the most important problem that I saw was the military transfer problem. So I'm sure some of you know I went to Miami Beach in 1972. I attempted to point this out to the Republican Party, and what I got was outright hostility. These are things we just don't talk about. Looking at the Wall Street Journal last week and noting that Arm & Hammer gave the Republicans $100,000 in 1972, I can see that I wasn't playing the right game. I certainly didn't give them anything like $100,000. Now, to summarize the National Suicide Book, there is no question in my mind that Soviet military capability essentially depends on Western technology. But there is one exception I would point out, that you do not need a free enterprise system to develop military technology, because the military work in a rather different way to an industrialist. The military say, well, this is the next specification we want. They set up a specification and they work towards it, and cost is no object. But within, of course, industry, cost is very much part of your objective. You've got to be competitive. And so what the Soviets have been very successful in doing is setting up a very adequate, a very sensible design, military design specifications, and using Western technology to work towards it and do it quite capably. So I'm quite sure that aircraft with our systems and their ships and their guns are quite effective. To give you some examples, American pilots were coming back during the Vietnam War, and they were saying, well, that's funny because those trucks on the Ho Chi Minh Trail look like Ford trucks. Well, they were Ford trucks because half of them were coming from the Gorky plant, which was built by the Ford Motor Company. And you've got the MiGs over Korea, which I pointed out earlier, had Rolls-Royce engines, and Rolls-Royce and some of the German designs, BMW, have been the basis of a Russian jet development. So that is approximately the story. What we need today is research to fill out the gaps in our knowledge of the loss of American independence. And there are two major areas which I suggest need study in depth. One is the Federal Reserve System, particularly the political role of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York from 1913 up to today. Clearly, the Federal Reserve System controls money supply, and therefore is a very important, if not a dominant factor, in what happens in the economy. This whole attempt to replace gold with artificial fiat money is part of this whole problem that I think has to be investigated. But up to the moment, we can't even get an audit of the Federal Reserve System. The second area, which I think needs to be investigated, is the Council on Foreign Relations. I don't have that much evidence myself, but a number of people I respect have, well, a great number of people I respect have pointed out that members of this particular council turn up in a number of key places on a very regular basis. I suspect that one can dismiss 90% of them as being academic hangers-on or social climbers, but there's a core in there which probably well warrants investigation. I can tell you this much. Certainly in the 1920s, where the State Department files are open, there is very clear evidence that members of the Council on Foreign Relations were fundamental